First of all, I'd like to really thank FCW for dealing with all the wild cards associated with this event. You have no idea how many different permutations and combinations they considered along the way. And so when Scott and I were talking about preparing for this, one of the things that we said is we are going to take one wild card out of play here, which is that you will know that we have some analog output devices here in our hands. And that was a conscious decision in that we wanted to just have one less wild card in the mix because there's been a lot along the way. So COVID has really required us to think in different ways about a lot of different issues. I'm a big sports fan. I watched 3 UVA championship games last night. A spoiler alert, they won the national championship at about 11:45 last night when I watched the replay. And one of the things that it did with this event is I started to think about how Scott and I could best maximize our time. And so what I thought we would do is I said, okay, let me imagine that I am in your shoes. Let me imagine that I'm a records management officer within an agency. And I've spent a lot of time with a lot of you folks. And I thought I would take advantage of the expertise that Scott has on the practical side by posing some of the questions that people have asked me and sort of assume the persona, if you will, of a records manager. So in preparing for that, I had some COVID time, and I read 2 documents, actually multiple documents. I read the RIMSA report for last year, and so if I refer to any data, it is in the context of that RIMSA report, Records Management Self-Assessment. I also read the 46 submissions that have come in so far from the senior agency officials for records management, the SORM folks, and specifically question 8, which talk about the challenges that they are. It's really good reading if you want a sense of what's going on. So if I refer to an agency, I'm drawing that directly out of their question 8 submissions to the SORM report just a couple of months ago. So I thought I would start with one report that really caught my eye because I think it captures some of the issues that Lisa talked about, that Amanda talked about, that the other speakers are going to talk about during the course of the next few hours or so. And that was the Homeland Security submission, SORM submission. And here's some of the issues they raised, and I think it provides a context for some of the questions that I want to ask Scott in my records management persona. So their key challenges, first of all, unfunded mandates. Everybody's dealing with that. Inherited legacy systems, a big issue as you start to think about this moving forward. They are dealing with a large Office 365 implementation. And what does that mean? And how are they going to go about that? They are dealing with culture and change management. Big issues in terms of changing the approach that people take to records management problems. They are dealing with training issues in terms of bringing people up to speed with what modern records management looks like. And lastly, they're dealing with people that are already overstressed, being pulled in multiple directions and trying to figure out how to do that. So with that context, let me hop into some specific questions in my little records management persona. And we'll get the benefit of some of the practical experiences that Scott and the QAI folks have had for a number of years dealing with some of these issues. So the first thing that I wanted to chat about is this question, and this is near and dear to my heart as an old AIM guy, near and dear to my heart, the difference between documents and data, and why are documents so darn pesky when it comes to figuring out what you do. What are some of the unique attributes associated with documents that make the challenge different than data?
There's quite a number of things, actually, and I think that both Lisa and Amanda touched on the effort to have to digitize. In fact, I think even Lisa touched on that a lot of this M-19 effort is around the look back, right, and the what do we do moving forward. So one of the things that we look at is really at the heart of all of this is how to make documents into data. And whether or not there's techniques and technologies and so forth that lend themselves for automation. We hear about things like RPA, and we hear about things like AI and other useful types of technologies, but how practical are they in the real world of taking large collections of material and beginning to put them through a digitization effort? That's really one of the primary challenges that we deal with To sort of answer that question, that's the distinction between the document and the data issue. There's a lot of different technologies that start with the capture devices that then lead to the softwares and the reliability and the recognition and so forth that occurs, not only around what we can do to standardize a process, but also what we do to deal with the variability. So a little more complex than I think most people consider it to be. And that is kind of one of the areas that we lend the expertise of defining what is practical in terms of the approach.
Yeah, one of the things that I usually do when I tell people to think about looking at and identifying whether they have a document problem, it's things like do inquiries, responses to inquiries take too long? Are you keeping information longer than you should? Is some of the stuff that you have redundant, obsolete, and trivial? In other words, rot in the equation. Are you having a hard time figuring out what's a copy, what's an original, what's the latest version, all of that kind of stuff? And do you have a lot of information that has no specific owner? And so if you have those characteristics, odds are that you specifically have a document problem, and that really raises unique characteristics associated with the information management challenges associated with that. So, second question. Okay, I'm a records manager. I'm trying to figure out where I am, whether I'm ready for this. What do I need to know in order to accurately assess my readiness? And I think some of the things that occur to me along the way is in that RIMSA report, for example, when people were asked whether they were prepared for FOIA requests, big part of a federal government agency, 67% said they had gaps in that capability. Clearly a document management problem. We also asked whether people specifically had a digitization strategy. Only 44% said yes. So talk a little bit about that question of how do you look at what you're doing and figure out whether you're prepared or not?
The practical and the how really around, how do I determine my readiness? I think the RIMSA report has been one of, the key documents that NARA's been able to lend some advice on in terms of the agency's readiness. But it's just a starting ground. I mean, there are so many vertical components to that, whether it's the records piece, it's the cloud component, and others. And so I think that's probably a pretty solid starting ground for how a records manager ultimately assesses their readiness. But that item that Amanda mentioned a little bit earlier around alignment, really, and learning more broadly that moving forward, electronic content isn't just the role and responsibility of a records manager, that it now has impact to other folks within the organization, which ultimately lend themselves to this ability to be ready for a particular agency. So getting alignment with staff and getting alignment with other people within the organization, I think, is promoted from our perspective. Being able to drill down specifically on the items that NARA is sort of scoring the agency on to prepare themselves for this change. I think a lot of those items can be done with things like a checklist and so forth that we've come up with, but they all involve some degree of thorough assessment. And I don't think the information has existed, or even if it has, with the agency to be available to pull from. I think it constantly needs to go. You need to go back and review and assess the currency, or how current it is, and then invite other strategically aligned folks from the organization into that conversation. What we're finding with the conversations we're having thus far with different agencies is there's a lot of material that's in certain places that maybe should or shouldn't be considered, and all of that needs to be within the scope of determining the agency's readiness. And in some cases, we have systems in place to understand where these records are, and in other cases we don't. The majority of the agencies that have reached out to us thus far are very large. They've got multiple locations. When I say multiple, I mean hundreds of locations. And then more than likely, in all of these locations, there are critical and permanent, and in some cases temporary records. So who has the intelligence of all of that? And that's why I think the alignment of building a communication plan within the agency becomes important. And
that's a really good hopping off point to the next question, which is this question of the plan. and how do you build a plan, and what elements are in the plan. And so, as I've thought about this in my little records manager persona, some of the things that occur to me that I think need to be addressed in a strategic context from an agency perspective rather than a tactical one. First of all, the cloud, and how are you going to deal with the cloud, and what are the components of the cloud, and how are you going to deal with security in the cloud, and all those the whole cluster of cloud issues. The second thing, I think, is this question of dealing with all information. And you touched on that a minute ago about, this isn't just a question of a few documents in boxes. This is the whole fabric of communication that exists in an organization. So that's kind of the second thing. It's important. And then I think the third thing, we'll touch on modernization in a few seconds here, but this question of automation. How do I deal with the interaction between information on the one hand and the processes that use that information, and get that information in a format such that those processes can be automated. So talk a little bit about that, this question of how do you build a plan, what are the elements of a plan, how do you go about that kind of thing?
So the plan has become critical to all the conversations we're having to date with agency officials, whether the conversation begins at the records level or it begins with somebody more senior. I think the plan really helps to connect expectations around the scope of what the agency is attempting to do. So on the earlier slide, we talked about, how do we move towards a better readiness situation? And I think part of the answer to that is building the plan. Logically, we would start with some form of an assessment with the organization, and it would take into consideration an understanding for where the records are, whether some of them are currently electronic, whether most of them are in hard copy. But the plan becomes the instrument, really, to help connect the voice and the message to the records into what was mentioned earlier, which is an unfunded initiative to senior leaders to help design a method for moving the agency closer to compliance. And so we've come up with some fairly complex plans thus far because the situations have been relatively complex. We see a lot of similarities within the agencies, and we also see a lot of differences in terms of what it is they're attempting to overcome. But the plan is our approach. There's probably a mention on our slide somewhere around this Edge 22 piece. We've productized what we're doing with the approach to develop the plan. It's helped organizations come up with a mechanism that's manageable. We've got things on a relatively short timeline that we need to achieve. So we've got to get certain things into place at a certain time period. And the plan is all of what keeps us communicating together, right, as a group, and ultimately meeting those objectives.
Yeah, you've used that little EDGE acronym with me before, and I really like it because it talks about the need to educate your agency. It talks about the need to document your processes. It talks about the need to generate a plan. And then the pesky part along the end, and we're going to talk about this in a little more detail too, the reality where the rubber meets the road is how on earth you execute it. Because it's one thing to have all these grand statements, it's another thing to actually do it on the ground at enormous scale. I mean, just gigantic scale when I think of some of the customers that I've talked to along the way. So next question, that ties into this one, which is modernization. And, it's kind of funny. I mentioned that I ran AIM for a number of years, and, sometimes I get a little bit of a deja vu all over again feel when we start talking about records management, information governance, because we've been talking about this like forever. And I think the epiphany maybe that's occurring right now is the realization that those practices with regards to governance ultimately have a bearing not only on where you keep the boxes and where you keep the documents and how you store the documents, but how do you activate that information and engage it in part of a modern business process. So talk about that question of modernization. What are the elements to it? How do you go about it? How do you adopt a forward-looking feel to what you're trying to do?
Yeah, well, one of the things that we're finding, and not in all cases, but there are certainly agencies that are attempting to comply with the specifics of not having paper being stored in FRC facilities in the future, and taking this initiative, I guess, as an agency and bringing into consideration what a more modern plan for managing data would look like moving forward. And I think we're in kind of a unique time, just even sitting on the stage, John, with you right now. Most of our viewers are probably at home and probably logged in to getting access to the information we're providing today. But infrastructure, I think, is a big part of the modernization plan, both the storage components that we're dealing with internally to the agency, access, bandwidth, softwares and so forth that are going to help to protect and secure the access to this information. So the capture devices, obviously, and the softwares and so forth that can lend themselves to better automation and less labor involvement. So these are just a lot of the things that are arising. There's a lot of great technologies, a lot of players that we've been involved with historically that get involved in the modernization discussion. But it goes from everything to a change in mindset of the way that you're going to go about accessing information, to changes within the infrastructure, to security considerations, to storage and availability. So a lot of things have come up. And it's been a very interesting term in regards to M-19 because a lot of the progressive agencies are considering a plan around improvements to the modernization of the agency as a result of attempting to get themselves ready for M-19.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about this question of modernization and how, tough times and crazy times make you rethink some of the things that you never thought you could do before. And, we just recently, yesterday, I had a telemedicine appointment with my 88-year-old mom and her orthopedic guy. And I was thinking, okay, 3 months ago, there is no way that would have occurred in that context. And I also thought, after the fact, there is no reason why we should have been in the office in the first place. And so I think when it comes to information, what this is highlighting for everybody is all those questions that you talked about you have to be able to share information, you have to collaborate, you have to do it in a secure fashion, you got to be able to do all those things in a very decentralized environment. And I think that's probably going to be a good thing for us all long term in terms of thinking about how M-19-21 maps to those modernization initiatives that everybody has to do. So,
well, I'll touch on one other thing too. I think just in talking about the relevant nature of the current situation, sending our staff home and being in a remote environment, we've all been through just recently tests of what it's like not to have access to those legacy materials that have traditionally been in hard copy. So all the things I think that we can consider today are relevant to the modernization plan.
All right, next question. This one gets a little sensitive within agencies sometimes. And so, the way I phrased this was, how do I as a records official make senior agency officials better understand the importance of records? This is like one of those issues that for records people has been with us for a gazillion years. And two quotes within the SORM reports really highlighted for me sort of different elements of that. And then I want you to talk about how you sell this stuff internally. The first quote was from the U.S. Access Board in their report. And they said, a constant challenge is the lack of IT staff understanding of the rules of records disposition. And that's kind of one constituency that needs to better understand what records management is all about, that there are different approaches when it comes to documents and records than in managing data. Second one is that this was actually from an AIM survey of both government and business officials, and they said 45% of organizations said that their senior executives are not engaged at all or only somewhat engaged when it comes to information governance. So if you're going to do this M-19-21 thing, you got to sell up in the organization. How do you go about that? What are the elements of that? How do you make your case?
That's a great question. In fact, given at whatever level the entry point is to the conversation that we as an organization have with the agency, there are a lot of cases where we're working through the process of trying to get broader attention to the problem. And so we recommend, obviously, we go back to an item we mentioned earlier, which is the plan. And I don't think there's a lot of differentiation in answering this question for whether or not you're an employee of a private sector company or you're an employee of a public agency. The key to this is communication, and the key to this is developing a plan that includes some form of a solution, even if there are multiple solutions. I think the further north, as we know, we go in our organizations and to that executive level of leadership, these folks have a tremendous amount of responsibility in most cases, and what they're looking for a lot of times is a definition of what it is that we're trying to do as an agency, and ultimately, what is the plan to get there? And so a lot of our initiatives, really from a consulting and an advisory capacity, have been to help the agency develop not only the how, but also focus on the types of solutions that could exist. I know later on we have a discussion around should I outsource or should I insource, and these are all questions really that become relevant to that plan. And I know in my personal preferences, when I'm attempting to get something up that's above and beyond the level that I can make a decision, I think really hard about what information would I want to have in my hands if I were the key decision maker behind all of this, right? Not just, bring me what it is that we don't have or the gap analysis that doesn't already solve the problem, but let's take into consideration what the solution could look like, even if it has multiple flavors. And so that has been a key role that we've been playing for a number of the relationships that we have currently.
This next question I really wanted to dovetail. I thought of it before, but Lisa highlighted this in her comments, talking about this question of day forward strategy and sort of leveraging what you have with where you're trying to go. And two agency comments in the SORM report really struck a bell with me. And the first one was from the IRS, and in their question, they talked about the challenges associated with, they'd love to go all electronic, but taxpayers don't have to file electronic. So they have a hybrid world for the foreseeable future looking forward, and how do they manage that? There was another one. I just want to get the quote right. Which was from the Surface Transportation Board. And they talked about, this is really interesting, they said they had a bunch of records that weren't required to be transferred to NARA until after 20, 30 years. And so now all of a sudden, they were planning on shipping all that stuff eventually off in paper form, but they have to go back now and digitize all that stuff. So talk about that little question of forward-looking versus what you have, how do you manage the bridge between the two, all that kind of stuff.
A great question, too, and obviously very relevant, I think, to anybody that's considering how do we deal with the change overall. At some point, 12/31/22 will pass, and we'll be looking at how to bring the agency forward. So what we find is that the day forward solutions and plans are largely leveraged from the best practices and the lessons learned from the projects and so forth that we do with the agency. The technologies that are left behind and the user adoption that's involved in using this changed protocol and changed plan are all part of how we define the go-forward strategy. But they tend to be smaller solutions, if you will, because in theory we've sort of tackled that legacy problem. And the day-forward solution, at least as it relates to hard copy, we would like to believe that paper will become less of a medium for an exchange of how we manage content. And now we've moved into more of a what and how do we manage the data itself. So day forward is extremely important. I think it as I said, it's leveraging a lot of the best practices. It's leveraging the ways that we've gone about classifying information, creating metadata. We also get a look at the guidelines that have been put in place for the variability of all these different sites. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the agencies we deal with have a lot of different locations, and there's things within those locations that are done right that are not always standard necessarily. And so the day forward plan, I think, is an opportunity to get continuity and standardization as well from the agency moving forward.
So conscious of the fact that you want to build a strategy moving forward, and then pursuant to Lisa's comment that you can't just abandon all that stuff that you have in those file cabinets all over the place. That inevitably leads to digitization. That inevitably leads to the whole question of outsourcing and who does this. And I kind of laugh about this a little bit because one of the plus sides of having capture and scanning technology so ubiquitous, like in Best Buy and places like that, is that at least people know what the hell you're talking about when you go in to have a chat about them. The downside is that everybody thinks they can hire like their nephew's cousin to come in on a summer job and scan, 1 billion records during their off time. So that inevitably leads to outsourced decisions. That's in your sweet spot. How do you think about that question?
Obviously, the core of what keeps an organization like Quality Associates thriving in the space, but I think there's a lot of questions that need to be asked. I think the first one is the agency's responsibility to think about what is its core mission, right? Is its core mission to become a scanning company? And I think that has to be asked. The other thing is, oftentimes when we get on the phone around the M19 concern and consideration, if the conversation, for example, begins with records managers, the first thing that they let us know is how understaffed they are, right? And so the ability to bring a lot of this stuff in-house without the consideration of outsourcing it would be putting at risk the timeline and the ability for the agency to become compliant with M19. So outsourcing obviously is a major consideration. It's been talked about throughout the course of both of our series thus far. If nothing else, I think it's worth looking at one key item that we know will come up from leadership, which is cost, right? And so can I be more effective by outsourcing? Can I get better results? Can I manage my timeline? Can I do it within budget? With a group that does this every day versus the ability to potentially bring this as an in-house service. So clearly, we're a bit of an advocate of outsourcing. We feel we can do it better, faster than anyone else in the industry. However, there are a lot of cases where we go into hybrid plans, and the hybrid plan is not always just to outsource the work. It involves keeping the institutional knowledge of the agency in place and having those folks get integrated into our process. As I mentioned, it is an area where we do lend a lot of expertise. It's a place that we get up every day and speak to and from. So if folks in the audience are still trying to tackle that how, I think that an organization like Quality Associates can help answer that question and also help to make a determination as to whether it makes sense to outsource or not.
Yeah, the way I usually think about this, straight up how you were talking about it, is, understand that it's going to be a hybrid world. It's going to be a hybrid world of paper and electronic. It's going to be a hybrid world of in-source and outsource. Moving forward, you have to look at the scale associated with all of this. You have to look at the whole question of how complex are the documents that you're trying to manage, how complex are those collections, where are you starting from, all that stuff. And so, I'm a big advocate of stick to the mission, stick to the core, stick of what you do, and that's what folks like you all do. And it's also, an agency doesn't necessarily do that kind of stuff. So I think we are running out of time, and so I think Troy is coming back up. There is a last question that we didn't get to that I'd like to urge the chat to really kick this around a little bit, and Scott and I might be online, and maybe we can kibitz on a little bit online, which is this question. I'm really intrigued by capstone and kind of a capstone approach to email management. And for those of you that don't know capstone, what it's all about is basically assigning records practices by the role within an organization in order to try to simplify the question. And at the last bridge meeting, which both Scott and I listened to, there was a lot of conversation about that. So I think one of the things I'd like to urge people to do is kick that around a bit. There's a lot of challenges, a lot of complexity still in its early stages, and I think that's a place we can have an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, sounds great.
So, Troy?
Thank you, gentlemen.
I'm glad Troy's back because they, Troy mentioned that we're the only ones really here except for the technicians. And, when they say if you're nervous about speaking, you should imagine your audience in their underwear. And looking out at Troy, it's been a terrifying proposition for all of us here. So.
That is, truer words were never spoken. I do want to get a couple questions. I know you both are going to go into the chat room to sort of pick this up. But one that came in was whether encryption of records for archive was permitted by NARA?
That is a good question, and that is a challenge that I've heard from a number of people along the way, because it has to do with national security issues, obviously a question that's near and dear to NSA and DOD and CIA and folks like that. And so I would defer to Lisa, I think, who is still hanging around here, and to answer that question, but it's a really good question.
Okay. And then this one, I'm just going to read verbatim, which is, in a hierarchical structure, how does a staff office at the bottom go about planning to meet the 2022 deadlines? For example, do we wait for guidance at Commerce from NOAA or from a line office to take or to take initiative ourselves? So the top-down versus bottom-up challenge.
I'll grab that one, because that is the likelihood of a lot of the conversations we have, at least in the initial discovery call. I think you got to be proactive. I think there's a lot of competing efforts that exist within agencies. We're in a very difficult and challenging time at the moment that I think has become very distracting to a lot of these missions and so forth. So the key, I think, would be to be proactive. I know you have some feedback from NARA as to where you are from a readiness perspective. You have access to certainly folks like us that can make available checklists and ways to become proactive and get an action plan in place. But by all means, I don't see the agencies being successful with this, being complacent or sitting back and waiting.
Yeah, I think just on my side, I get this question all the time about top down, bottom up, and the answer is yes. And so from top down, I think what needs to happen is that SORM people need to stop just handing this off as if it's some pesky problem that has to be dealt with by records managers. Because how you manage information in a digital world is critically important to your ability to deliver on the agency's mission. So that has to be an important thing from a top-down perspective in terms of setting priorities. From a bottom-up, records managers, and they're doing this, they need to expand their vision of what they do and interject themselves into legal conversations, into process conversations, into FOIA conversations. All those processes that an agency deals with, they need to be part of.
Very good. And last question here before we pivot is, at the last bridge meeting, they indicated, I love the government scale questions, they indicated only 3 million cubic feet of records of storage are left at the FRC. Will that be enough?
That is an item, in fact, that did come up at the last bridge meeting, was the capacity. Lisa touched on the plan, or at least the plan that exists currently for getting documents to the FRC. I think that's an item that we probably want NARA to speak to. Nor John nor I are measuring out the square footage of available space at the FRC locations. But it's not the first time we've heard or seen the concern around the potential limited capacity, but it's definitely a NARA item.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting as that deadline approaches. I think it's going to be like, holy cow, get this stuff over as quickly.
Get it in now.
And what does that wave look like towards the end?
So a different curve for us to worry about in the coming days. And then a couple of people had asked about, what does a plan look like? But I know you talked about that on several levels, and I think that's a really good one to take into the chat room and sort of address individually. So, gentlemen, thank you both for sort of running through these key questions, and I know you're here to engage with people in the other digital space today.
Yeah, so thanks to the audience for going with the flow, too.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.